it's one of these things. I know you never did this when you were in office, but where a politician sees a problem and finds a scapegoat and makes him the brunt of people's anger instead of dealing with the real issue, which is a long-term solution, if indeed there is a solution. So rent controls don't work, and I literally suggest that there is no example in America, except for a very short term, of rent controls ever working in the long run.
You know, I probably actually did do that once or twice, but I'll be damned if I'm going to give anybody any examples.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We have a great panel on New Frontiers today. Elliot Pollock, the economist, Bob Robb, the columnist, as well as Professor Henry Thompson. Now today, the meat of what we're going to be talking about is the economy, but it is the last 2/3 of our show. In the front portion of this, we do spend a little bit of time talking about the Trump trial, and I just wanted to make a few comments about this before we go on. Now, as a disclosure, I definitely don't see Trump as being a victim in this trial. Over and again, he causes his own problems. I believe that Trump pretty much kind of gets what he deserves, but I don't believe that his supporters got what they deserved. I'm embarrassed by the celebrations that happened after the Trump conviction, as if it was some political trophy to hang on a wall. There's really nothing all that good about this for anyone on any side. We say that we want to make certain that he was accountable because of the rule of law. Well, I'm not really sure that this is going to help the rule of law. He may have gotten what he deserved, but yet somehow I'm worried that it will not benefit those values that we cherish most. But what I'm most concerned about are the people who are listening to this show who are on the other side of me. We are Americans. We're family. Here, Biden wins. We're going to survive this either way. But we have to quit dancing on the other person's grave. We have to hold together. Be nice. Let others know that you care about them, as I know that you do. And if you want to be patriotic, quit insulting other Americans. Anyway, welcome to the New Frontiers. If you're interested in watching this show, press that subscribe button and let's get going. Well, I'd like to welcome all of our guests here today. We have a terrific panel. I'm excited about them. We have Bob Robb, who is a columnist was with the Arizona Republic. Today, he has his own column that he puts out there. I believe, Bob, you were also a Hoover Fellow years ago. I don't know if that's something that continues or not. But nonetheless, Bob has been
media fellow, but yes.
Bob has been considered a conservative columnist and has done a great job. We've all known him for years. I tried to hide from him during the time I was in political office. I figured if he didn't know my name, I'd actually score better. Then we have the Oracle, which is Elliot Pollock. Like, if you ever really want to know what's going to happen in the economy, there are all these two-handed economists that John Kennedy talked about. Elliot actually is pretty good about saying, well, if you do this, this is probably what's going to happen. And I've used him for a number of years, as have many, many people across the country and certainly Arizona. And then my new, or our old friend here, new name, which I like calling him Lord Thompson, just because of his background in coming from New Zealand and his loyalty to the Queen. Henry, thanks for being on the show. And we also appreciate certainly you being a professor at our university.
Her Majesty's loyal subject.
Okay, so I'm going to start with this because I think it's important. This show should come out right around June 6th. That will be D-Day, which was a very, very important date for the United States and maybe for the entire world. And I think sometimes we forget the importance of the sacrifice that people have made. One of the stories that I'm going to start just by telling, and I'm going to ask all of you your favorite book or your favorite movie or any experience that you had, but one of the great things that I did is I took my family actually to the beaches in Normandy, and I highly recommend it if anyone ever gets a chance. When you see that beach, you recognize how long it was. You can still see what they called the concrete pillboxes that were on the shore itself. you recognize how incredible a sacrifice these young men made. But when we went up into the village, in the little town that's right up at the top, it looks identical to what it looked like in 1944, because you can see the picture of the American troops driving down this town. And then when you look at the town, it looks exactly like it did then. And I met this woman who had spent a significant amount of time living through that period of her life. She said she was there when the Nazis first came in as a little girl. And she said when the first Nazis came in, they really weren't so bad. But when the SS and others came in, they were absolutely brutal to them. They put their husbands into, or fathers into, working down on building these concrete structures, took over their families, and did pretty horrific things. She said what was amazing to her, though, was that when the Americans arrived and they went through her town, she said two things stood out to her. The first one was there were these good-looking American soldiers going through, and one of them, she said, came over and gave her a little piece of chocolate. And she said, now, Mayor, I was mayor at the time, she said, do not ever let anybody tell you that the Swiss have the best chocolate. That Hershey's chocolate's the best chocolate anywhere in the world. And then the second thing she said, you know what amazed us, though, is she said, they gave it back. You know, when we were taken over by the Nazis, we knew they weren't giving it back. And we kind of thought in the beginning when the Americans took this, they weren't giving it back either. So at the end of the war, there were 9,000 soldiers spread out around farms that had been buried. And she worked with the councils, and they de-annexed a piece of land where that beach is. And they took those bodies all back, put them in that graveyard, and faced them back home. You'll see Stars of David and crosses and everything else. It's an amazing sight. And when you see the amount of bodies there, you recognize how many people sacrificed for it. Any event. So for the rest of you, favorite movies or favorite books relating to D-Day?
Well, I'll just say that I was there, and when you look at the beach and the cliffs, you say it's impossible anybody actually got up these cliffs and lived. It's one of the most remarkable things I can imagine after actually seeing it. And you're right. I would bike through farmland. In the middle of a farm, there'd be a little cemetery, and that became,
amazing
amazing.
Thing.
For me, D-Day has a bit of a different meaning. My father fought on the front lines in some of the most brutal battles in the Pacific, and D-Day represents a turning of total energy and focus to the Pacific Theater. And my dad was preparing to be part of the initial landing force on the island of Japan, and told me that he had reconciled himself, having been a war casualty a couple times already, that he wasn't going to survive. So D-Day for me represents both a victory over tyranny in Europe, but also a poignant moment for our family, which was spared by the dropping of the atomic bombs.
Professor Thompson, give us a kind of your thought, especially you grew up in New Zealand. What was the view of it from there? Is it just a side event, or how is it viewed?
Well, yeah, I grew up in New Zealand. I also lived in Germany for a very long time, for 5 or 6 years in Germany, most of it in Berlin. And so, of course, the New Zealand view, and both my grandfathers fought in the Second World War, was more similar to the British view. So my maternal grandfather had fought in the Pacific in some of the very early action against the Germans in places like Fiji, trying to defend Fiji and some of these remote Pacific islands from potential German attack. And then he was actually injured in some of the battles in North Africa right before the Battle of El Alamein, which was where the German General Rommel, who actually was directing some of the German defenses against the Americans and Allied forces in D-Day. That's where Rommel had some of his great successes, was in North Africa. So my maternal grandfather saw some of that action, and my paternal grandfather, my father's father, was in the Pacific, like Bob's father. He was a radar operator for the New Zealand Air Force. And so my view of D-Day is one of it must have been a huge relief when D-Day was a success, because so much fighting had gone into preparing getting the strategic situation to a point where the Allies were able to make that landing. And if it hadn't worked, then who knows how much longer the war could have ground on. When I lived in Germany, obviously their view of the war is different. The Eastern Front is extremely sort of central to the Germans' experience of the Second World War, simply because of the degree of loss and death and the decisiveness of those big battles at Stalingrad, etc., to the general trajectory of the war for the Germans. But the D-Day landings were extremely important because they were really, putting the last blow to the Nazi Empire, and it wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, for the Nazi Empire to be brought down properly without the United States being brought to bear on the Western Front, similarly to the First World War. So, huge turning point in Western history, the beginning of American involvement and permanent involvement in Western Europe. It goes on to this day and has been a very successful uh, thing, really, for the whole continent and for the world, as we talk about a lot on this podcast, that America's influence in Western Europe and elsewhere, due to that success after D-Day, has been so important.
Yeah, I think my favorite book is called D-Day by Stephen Ambrose. He did a great job of it. But the movie that everybody knows is Saving Private Ryan. Probably my favorite line in that movie is when they're trying to hold that bridge, just hold it long enough that other troops can get there. And both Tom Hanks has been shot as well as the sergeant. And when he's lying there and the young guy is speaking to him, Private Ryan, he says, "Earn this." Right, and it's kind of one of those fade in shots where they go back to where he was buried, and to me that's a very powerful thing, because I think it's easy for us to forget, especially in this era of this incredibly divisive politics that exists today, where we have both sides pointing their finger at one another, both sides talking about how terrible our country is. Two people running for office that are maybe the two most unpopular individuals I've ever seen run for office on either side. Now, this week was the trial, and I'm going to do the best that I can describe as to what Donald Trump was found guilty of. But Bob, I'm going to ask you to try to improve upon what it is that I put out here. So my understanding is that there was a jury. There were 34 counts. The first issue is the issue of the misdemeanors, which is whether or not he falsified business records in an attempt to defraud individuals, to defraud people. And on that has been used in the past. It's been used in a wide variety of different areas, including literally dealing with problems that where business records had been falsified on credit cards and on transit issues and a whole series of other things. But the unique portion was their attempt to try to say that if you do that in an attempt to cover up another crime, it becomes a felony. And on that, what they utilized was the laws that regulate campaign finance, where you have certain limitations as to how much money you're allowed to give, and you have certain disclosure rules in terms of what you have to give. Now, the rule has been used on other things like violating IRS standards or defrauding IRS, but it's never been used in campaign finance law, making that the transition. And that's become kind of part of the controversy. I'm going to want to go through kind of how everybody feels about this, but Bob, did I cover that right? Does it seem like it's kind of at least in the right direction to you?
Certainly in the right direction, maybe some amplification. So the fundamental underlying accusation is that Trump falsified business records to hide the hush money payments to the porn star and disguise them improperly as legal payments to Michael Cohen. That would be a misdemeanor in and of itself, and the statute of limitations on it has long run. So the accusation is that he did that not simply to cover up the hush money expenditures, but to hide or further an additional crime. there were three different theories as to what that additional crime might be. One was there is an election statute in New York about election fraud, that he was trying to hide this from the American people, and somehow that was a fraud, an election fraud committed on the American people. The second theory was that it was an illegal campaign contribution. John Edwards faced similar charges under similar circumstances. Some of us find it difficult to understand how it can be, how something that could not be reported as a legal campaign expense, which a hush money payment to hide an affair would not be a legal campaign expenditure, how that can be a illegal campaign contribution. That was one of the theories of the felony crime. And the third was some form of tax evasion, because they scaled up the payments to Cohen so that he would be after tax held harmless. The problem, I think, for many people is that the jury was told that it did not have to reach unanimous agreement as to which of those theories applied in this case and what specific other crime Trump was attempting to hide. Each individual juror could pick his or her own additional crime as the justification. And I think you'll find that on appeal that probably will be the strongest argument to overturn the result. But that's sort of all the legal complications in as much as a nutshell as at least I can provide for them.
What do you think the effect is going to be on the body politic on this one?
It certainly energizes Trump's base. There's been a rallying around him. Even Trump critics such as Mitt Romney and Susan Collins have denounced what's occurred. The prosecutor ran for office, saying that he was going to go after Trump. That was part of his platform. So I think it certainly has not damaged Trump as the Republican nominee. On the other hand, there is at least some modest evidence that among undecided swing voters, it may have at least a temporary negative effect on him. It, and both Biden and Trump seem to be viewing the election as a base turnout election. If that's the case, then its result may be negligible. Over the last three election cycles, it's been undecided swing voters, independent swing voters, that have decided the outcome. If that is the case in 2024, then I think that this has a chance to damage Trump and make the race even closer.
Yeah, I'll put up a few slides and then I'll go to Professor Thompson. The first slide is a slide that points out that 52% of Americans believe that the prosecution of Donald Trump was mainly about enforcing laws fairly and upholding the law. The second slide was the morning consulting poll. And on that one, about half of the voters, 54%, approved the 12 jurors' historic decision to convict the former president. On Friday, the survey showed that 15% of Republican voters nationwide want Trump to drop his White House bid, with 8% of supporters say that he should that it may have an effect on changing their mind, and then roughly half the voters said they would oppose the former president's imprisonment for a 34 Class E felonies. Now, a couple of things. The first one is politics, I think, they're one on the margins. There are going to be 6 states that determine this election. And in those 6 states, it's probably going to be less than 150,000, maybe 200,000 voters that are actually going to matter. For the most part, everyone else in those states have made up their mind. You don't have to worry much about California, Texas, and New York, even though the numbers may narrow there more than they were in 2016 on either side. They may get closer. Texas is still going to go Republican, and New York and California are going to go Democrat. But in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, in Pennsylvania, I'm sure I'm missing one, or Georgia, those states, they're going to matter, and it'll be a small number of votes that actually do have an effect. And in that light, I think that this is going to have an effect, because not so much because of the law, but because I don't know if any of you watched any of the trial. I really couldn't watch much of it. The whole thing was disgusting. Everybody in it was disheartening, from the porn star and her comments, Michael Cohen's comments, the comments that came from the guy who had bought the story. But I don't think it bodes well for Trump either. In fact, my own personal opinion is I think Trump kind of gets what he deserves in all of this, but I don't think that the Trump voters are getting what they deserve. And that's the part that bothers me about this trial, is that instead of us talking about issues, I'm not talking about who to blame on this. I'm just saying that those voters deserve better than that. And when I watched people celebrating Trump's loss, I don't think that was helpful to their cause. I think that it, in fact, is harmful to their cause, because on the other hand, those independent voters, they don't like that. That's not what they're looking for out of politics. They want something better than that. And like, if I were giving a recommendation to either side as to how to get those voters, start with this: be nice. If you want to be patriotic, quit insulting other Americans. And in this particular case, I think it actually does have an effect.
Totally agree with you, Paul, that this is disheartening that the race is coming down to this kind of legal crisis or legal scandal one after another. Recall that just a few weeks or months ago, we had this decision from a Department of Justice official that he wasn't going to pursue charges or investigation of Joe Biden for some reason or another because he wasn't cognitively up to being interrogated or something. And that seems to have completely disappeared from the news cycle because it's been overwhelmed by yet another legal case, which is this case about the hush money with Donald Trump. But remember that apparently there's a trial against Hunter Biden starting this week. And so once again, we're going to have potentially this story overwhelmed by yet another story about scandals about the Trump or the Biden family that really don't speak to real Americans' needs and concerns at all. We talk here a lot about the economy. Bob had a really good piece just the other day talking about the deficit and the fact that Social Security is not going to be funded within about a decade. It's a crisis. It needs to be addressed, and yet that's not going to be discussed at all in this election campaign. We have war going on in Israel, in Gaza. We have a war going on in Ukraine, neither of which does it seem that there's a clear path to peace or a feasible peace deal. That's not going to get talked about in the campaign. And then we have the situation at the southern border where we have essentially uncontrolled immigration across the border. And it doesn't seem that's probably going to get discussed in the campaign either, because it's just going to be about these scandals. And America doesn't just deserve better, Paul, as you said. Americans really need better at this point because they need a better economy. They need to have some certainty about their Social Security and welfare benefits, and they need to have some sort of a plan for returning to some sort of international peace and order so that the American economy and Americans can start prospering again. So it's all extremely disheartening, and that's just as a prelude, because I hope we'll have a conversation too about the knock-on effects of this and whether this leads to this use of the judicial system and politicization of the judicial system for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think that is almost undoubtedly going to be true. I would not be at all surprised to see every administration from here on out pardoning everybody that worked for them. But in any event, Elliot?
Yeah, I'll just give you some background. I was a libertarian for years. I vote for the candidate. I don't vote for the party. I voted for Republicans. I voted for Democrats. It's the guy who I think, or the girl who I think, will do it best. And I never thought I'd get to the point in my lifetime I'd ever say this. I think the U.S. is becoming a banana republic. using techniques that shouldn't be dealt with in a democracy. It's just ridiculous that I don't like Trump personally, but what he had to face during his presidency and since is unprecedented. And some of it's real, some of it's not. It is not the basis on which you make decisions about who's going to best run the country. And I think this is a sad moment for us, and one that long-term we'll regret.
I agree. We're going to regret it. Bob, any other comments on this subject?
No, I mean, I'm a never Trumper. I believe that he attempted a coup to stay in office despite losing the 2020 election. And I think that's an unforgivable offense. However, I would agree with Elliot that the Russiagate investigation was a serious miscarriage of justice in the early years of the Trump years. And I believe that this particular case that we're discussing now should not have been brought. It is highly unfortunate that American politics have reached this nadir, and I hope that we will find our point of optimism, but I'm not seeing a way out.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, purely from a political standpoint, it is definitely fascinating and interesting to watch. But from an American standpoint, I think it's an incredible point of embarrassment. And again, it leads to it just amazes me to watch how there's this desire to dance on the other person's grave. It's I think it's highly problematic for our country. And again, I think those people who feel like somehow or another they gained a victory out of this trial, and again, I'm not a defender of Donald Trump in terms of what he's done, but those who think that they gained a victory and should celebrate on it, I tell them, if you actually want to win, you might be cautious with that, because that will backfire with you amongst the independents who want something better than what we're seeing. So let's utilize this to spin over and talk about economics. And again, we have the Oracle with us today, so I'm sure he hates that name, but nonetheless, Elliot, I want to ask you a couple of questions on the economy so that we can try to understand this. What I'm finding to be amazing are the amount of disconnects that exists inside the existing economy. Certainly, we have higher inflation. But when you start polling people, they're finding that the polling amongst Americans say that like 55% of them believe that this is the highest unemployment ever. They believe that we're in a recession by an overwhelming majority of people, that the economy is in the worst condition it's ever been. Can you help me try to understand this disparity that exists between the real numbers and what people are saying? Is this being driven because of partisan politics, or is it being driven because they see something different than what the numbers are showing? What's your view of that?
I think it's pretty straightforward, and that is that it's based on most people what they see when they go shopping, what they remember what the price was the last time they bought a car or a car now, what a dozen eggs used to cost versus what a dozen eggs cost now, what clothes cost, what their day-to-day living costs were or are compared to what they were. And I think that is what is affecting people's psyche, because the economy itself is not in terrible shape at the moment. We can talk about what's going to happen, but the bottom line is most people feel it is because the thing most close to them, which is their spending and how far their income goes, that puts them under pressure. Now, there's 4 people on this podcast who probably spend a lot of time at restaurants or going out. I'm blown away every time I get a check at a restaurant, just blown away. And it's not because the prices are going up so much right now, because they're not. Talk about that if you want. But it's what it was a few years ago. And that's what comes to mind. Geez, it never cost this much. It's out of control. And that's, I think, the major thing that affects people. And if that's bad, everything's bad.
So if you look at the inflation rate today, it looks like it's begun to dip. But yet, I hear from a lot of people who believe that the way that we utilize the indexes today really doesn't give an appropriate reflection of what's happening from an inflation standpoint. And I'm not really sure what to think on that. Can you help us try to understand that?
Well, it does not. And the CPI, which is not the Fed's, the index they look at, although they talk about it, it's the implicit price deflator for personal consumption expenditures, less food and energy. That's the main thing they look at. And inflation, or the CPI, about a third of it, amazing, is housing. And it's not housing prices. It's basically a owner's equivalent rent for your home, and that's really a survey, so it's not very good. And that hasn't come down yet. It really should, but it hasn't. We'll talk about why in a minute. On the implicit price deflator for personal consumption expenditures, it's about 16% instead of almost a third of the price index, and it's more related to real prices than an owner's equivalent rent, which is just, in my opinion, a guessing game. And so nobody knows exactly when that's going to come down. Rents nationally are actually starting to come down, apartment rents, and that's because it takes about 3.5 years to get an apartment from the time you decide you want to build an apartment till the time they rent it. It's about 3.5 years. So all the stuff that's coming on stream now, and there's a lot of it, that stuff was basically planned and went into the process when interest rates were very low. Now these guys are going to have to take the construction loan and turn it into a real loan at a period of high interest rates. So you have a ton coming on stream, and you have nothing going into the pipeline. So permits are very, very low. So you're going to have about a 3-year hiatus when rents are really under pressure. And then the whole thing starts over again, because 3.5 years from now, there'll be nothing coming out of the pipeline. So that's a real problem. The problem for single family housing is pretty straightforward. There's not enough supply. And that's because 3/4 of the people in this country who have mortgages of less than 4%. Well, are you actually going to leave a house that has a 3 or 4% mortgage, or in some cases a 2 3/4% mortgage, and pick up a 6.5 or 7% mortgage? Not likely. And so there's very few people putting their houses on the market. And then the other thing that I know we're going to talk about later is why housing prices are still going up. Well, it's not only supply and demand, but now more than a quarter of the cost of a house essentially is run by bureaucracy. You yourself did a sort of an off-the-cuff study when your son was building houses about how much time it took. And if I remember right, you told me it took more time to go through the bureaucratic process than it did to actually build the home. That's kind of scary, and that runs up costs like crazy.
We divided up the time perfectly on it to figure out what was design time and what was build time versus what was permitting time and inspection time. And there was more time on the regulatory side than there was on the actual construction.
Yeah. And so a lot of it's bureaucratic. Now, some of this, for example, infrastructure costs are actually starting to come down. And as there's less stuff going in. But are you going to get enough in the pipeline to actually cause housing prices to decline? I don't think so. There's too many constraints at the moment, and it takes too long to bring on a lot of supply. And for apartments, yes, apartment rents will go down. They're already starting to go down in Phoenix. In 2022, they went up for months at a 30% annual rate. They're now at negative annual rate. So rents are actually coming down, and they'll come down more as all this new stuff comes on stream, like 15,000 units this year, probably about 12,000 next. But following that, the pipeline empties out and there's a problem. So that's the problem with inflation. If you speak to people at the Fed, they're guessing. They don't really have a clue as to exactly how this is going to play play out, or when prices are going to come down, or by how much. They've been waiting for that for quite a while, and the economy is beginning to slow, but you don't see the types of declines that you would have expected given the constraints that housing is facing right now.
I'm going to take this into politics a little bit because it seems to me that there's a difference between how a renter will have seen the economy over the last 4 years versus a homeowner. If you were a homeowner, you had a 3.5–4% mortgage rate. You were able to kind of weather through that storm. Your mortgage payment stayed the same. But you can find in some areas where literally rents went from $900 to $1,000 for a rent up to $1,800 to $1,900 in a 3 or 4 year period of time. What I find to be interesting about that is those are Democratic voters. Those are traditionally, not all of them, but a large percentage of them are in the lower income area. And those voters would be somebody that Biden would be more dependent upon. But it seems to me that that voter is one who is going to be much more inclined to be angry. I mean, we're upset because we see a bill at the restaurant that's twice as high as it used to be, but it's still a very low percentage of our overall spending. On the other hand, if our rents would have gone up 3 times higher, 2 or 3 times higher, that would have been a significant effect on almost all of us.
Well, it's a question of where if you're a Democratic voter, quite frankly, you are more likely to blame the evil landlord or the company that owns your building than you are supply and demand. And it's easy. It's somebody you can recognize, blah, blah, blah. The news media does it all the time. If you're a baby boomer that owns a home, it was a newspaper article, but you probably didn't pay much attention to it. You're right. It's basically the millennials and that are really the brunt of this, and now the Gen Zs who are the brunt of it because they can't afford a home at a time in their life when historically people bought new homes or first-time homes. It's a real problem. And until you start to get to, all right, what's causing this? And it's strictly a supply-demand situation. And what's running up prices? Well, a lot of it's bureaucratic. A lot of it is the time it takes to get through the process, the costs that cities put on that are, in my opinion, unnecessary. I could go into detail on that, but you know them as well as I do. And the fact that the cities go from periods of understaffed to overstaffed, and quite frankly, the fact that planners are trained in either schools of liberal arts or schools of architecture, but never schools of business. So they don't understand how markets work, nor in my experience do they care. Now, I shouldn't say that. In general, they don't care. So there are every city has some excellent planners, some excellent people running the situation, but new guys coming out of school, not a clue. And that's a real issue.
So, Elliot, I have a question.
Sure.
I think this question of the supply pipeline of real estate is really interesting. If there's going to be a glut and these financing problems, is it possible that there's going to be kind of a dip in apartment prices in particular?
I would be surprised if there wasn't.
Because people can't look forward through to the knock-on effects of the supply constriction. They need financing now, so that some of them are going to be in trouble.
Some of them are going to be in trouble, and I'll just tell you what. I have a partner, and we've been looking, haven't found any yet. We're looking for smaller units where mom and pop kettle owns it, and they've got a mortgage from 10 years ago that's coming due, or from 5 years ago that's now coming due, and they need out.
Again, it could also be the demographic interacts with it too, that they just can't be bothered refinancing. If they're older, they might want to retire because they're to come back to the generational question.
Yes, that's most likely, because that's who owns most of these small apartments. Apartments are not all owned by big multi-billion-dollar corporations. Most of the smaller ones are mom and pop kettle, and most apartments are put together by syndications where mom and pop kettle invested. So, not just the evil owner.
But are you saying that further inflation is basically already pre-programmed, kind of like I've read that the house inflation from like 17 to today was basically pre-programmed because no one built after the Great Recession. Are you
Exactly.
saying that further inflation, and so it might be 5-7 years from now, but it's basically already priced in given demographic change, and we're not building anything right now?
5 to 7 years, yeah, it is. It's programmed in. It's a question of what's going to be built. If you go to places that have very, very low home ownership affordability rates, like California, like New York, what you get is much smaller units on much smaller lots, fewer setbacks, fewer amenities, and it's a different experience than when you're a 33-year-old kid here and you go out and your first house is an 1,850 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in a nice area. You probably put in a pool. That experience is going to change. That is abundantly clear to me because of my own experience in the real estate business, where I developed stuff to see what government does, which is to add costs, in my opinion, unnecessarily. Some people might disagree, but the extent of the increase in costs because of regulation is out of control. I do think, though, that the infrastructure costs will come down because infrastructure people have been really the supply-demand situation was outrageously aimed toward demand, and now it's going to be outrageously moved towards supply. Let's put it that way. So.
Elliot, time seems to me to have an effect also. Maybe you can talk about this. The idea that I mean, I'm absolutely positive. You give me 200 apartment units, get government out of the way, I can have it designed and built within 9 to 12 months. Put government into it, it's a minimum of 2 years, probably 3. Phoenix government, by the way.
For an apartment, probably 3. Probably 3. Yeah.
For California, you're 5. So the question becomes, when it takes that long of a delay to be able to get product supply to a marketplace that has demand, what artificial and effects does that have? What inefficiencies does that create?
Well, think about it. You're looking at a market and say, today this market is great. I want to be here. 3, 4, 5 years from now, the market dynamics might have changed dramatically. So it's a riskier deal. But even for single family homes, when I was a kid, when I first bought a house 100 years ago, it took probably 4 to 6 months to build a house. Today, it's 9 months to a year for a single family home. And it all that stuff adds to costs. And the number of things I have to put in that house is safety requirements, or what color I can paint the house, to what the setbacks are. Those are, a lot of these decisions should be marketplace decisions. If a builder builds a house that's crappy and it doesn't sell, no other builder is ever going to build that house again. But governments don't trust the private sector, is what it boils down to, which is interesting because as a private sector guy, I really don't trust government. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I've been in government, which when you made that comment about, I know you never did this. I was sitting there going, man, I come up with like 10 examples of where I did that. But
You'd be a fool if you hadn't. Self-preservation.
And that's it. When you're in government, right, who shows up, right? 400 neighbors show up and say, hey, we need this. The environmentalists show up and they say, we need that. And it's just this long list of people who are coming in with grievances. And how many times do you see the builders? Rarely. Right, when they're mad that it's taken them 2 years to get their permit through, then maybe you'll see them. But you don't make the connection. In fact, when Elliot was dealing with this issue, Elliot, we're going to talk about this issue. So we're going to do another program just on housing. But when Elliot was talking about this issue, we'd go out to elected officials. They saw zero connection, not just between their regulations, but between supply and demand. You couldn't get that thought through their head, how that was affecting cost. Their view was it was the evil private sector driving for profit.
Well, that's very interesting, guys. I really do think, Unfortunately, it's the New Zealandification of the American housing market. In New Zealand, there's been massive restrictions on building, in Australia too, for decades. And it's the question of housing has basically become the crucial political, economic issue in the entire country for both places, and it's never going away because there's not enough houses. You can't build more houses, and the people that own those houses have become so fabulously rich that they will never, ever, ever allow you to impinge upon them. And I think if that happens to America, that is a terrible, terrible shame, because to be honest, the fact that you can afford to buy a home here on a normal salary was one of the major draw cards for me wanting to come back to America instead of staying in England or going back to New Zealand or Australia.
It's already happened on the coasts, but the
Yeah.
fact that affordability issues are a problem in Phoenix, Arizona is that's kind of shocking. So what'll happen is there'll be incentives for people to move back to the Midwest, where there's so much of an oversupply of housing that house here
Which
it
is
is.
good. You have a safety valve, whereas in New Zealand and Australia, you can choose between Auckland, Sydney, or Melbourne if you want to have a decent job. And if you want to move there, they have you by the balls, and you have to buy in. My friends and I, we refer to it as the Ponzi scheme. If you want to buy into if you want to live in New Zealand, Australia, have a decent job, sorry, you got to buy a house from us, and we've got you.
I was going to say one very positive development was the support among Democratic legislators for the starter housing legislation that would have overridden a lot of the restrictions that you're talking about. To me, that was one of the more optimistic political developments I've seen in a very long while. And some of them were pretty staunch about it, including a legislator who previously was a litigator for the Arizona Civil Liberties Union. She was one of the strongest supporters.
It's not just poor people, it's teachers and people with what should be middle-class jobs that are getting really squeezed by this.
Yeah, I'm going to send you some charts, Henry, that we did that show what happened over time to what a teacher, a chef, a policeman, a fireman could afford. And you now have a situation where nobody can buy, those skills can buy a house unless they have two-income family. But the worst thing is that a lot of them can't even get an apartment in the city they work in. So that's.
And if you want to see where this can go and how crazy it can get, when I was at the University of Oxford as a postdoctoral fellow, I immediately ruled out ever trying to stay on there and getting a job, even though obviously it's a very prestigious university, because the colleges have to buy the houses for the junior faculty. And the junior faculty go into these, they form like a trust with the college, because a house, just a very, very modest English house, poorly heated, shitty plumbing and everything, is like £1 million. And the junior faculty are getting paid like £45,000 a year. And so the colleges would form these trusts to buy these houses. And essentially, like, the colleges were making profits off of these deals because they owned 80% of the house or something. And then when the faculty family had scraped together enough money, they buy the rest from the college, but they buy it back at market rate, and the colleges were just getting richer and richer. So I immediately was like, no way, I am not buying into your Ponzi scheme. I have a Ponzi scheme back in New Zealand. If I want to buy into it, I'm going back to America.
Last question before I ask the other panelists on this, their thoughts. So the reason I bring up the politics is, and again, I was a Democratic mayor, I tend to have an understanding of how this works. So if you're the ones pushing for regulations for whatever reason, and there's 1,000 reasons to push for regulations, if you're the ones adding the bureaucracy or adding the time, the last thing you want to do is make certain that you're the one that gets blamed. So there are two ways to not get blamed. The first one is to say, well, we put up a bunch of money for affordable housing. Now, the reality is affordable housing isn't going to make a dent in pricing. Just because,
and it's not affordable.
It's so small. It's a small number of homes that are going in. But the second thing that you do is just what you said. Blame the rich guy. Blame the landlord. What I find that exists in this that's interesting is you have homeowners. If you go to the, let's just say the people who are at the working end of the equation, you have homeowners and you have renters, and they're going to see the problem different. But it's also true, you're going to see the problem different if you're someone who's building apartments versus someone who owns apartments, guy who owns the apartments long term really doesn't mind if rents go up. On the other hand, the person who's building apartments doesn't want to see the regulations get in the way so much that it drives up their cost and makes it much less dependable in their ability to get supply out. I- the when you start to blame the landlord, first you're not really looking at reality of what's happening in terms of the economic thing, but more importantly, then you start going to things like rent controls, right? What we need to do is we need to put a limitation on those wealthy guys by putting rent controls in place. Can you give us your thoughts on that and what effect those types of restrictions actually have on the marketplace?
I've read everything I can on rent controls for about the past 40 years. And I will tell you that rent controls have never worked. Maybe in a very short time period, but in the long run, they push up prices and push down quality. Rent controls are not the answer. They are in most places the problem, and they just exacerbate the problem. You need more supply. Generally, the places that need rent controls are places that are where supply was constrained, generally constrained by government. And so it's one of these things. I know you never did this when you were in office, but where a politician sees a problem and finds a scapegoat and makes him the brunt of people's anger instead of dealing with the real issue, which is a long-term solution, if indeed there is a solution. So rent controls don't work, and I literally suggest that there is no example in America, except for a very short term, of rent controls ever working in the long run.
You know, I probably actually did do that once or twice, but I'll be damned if I'm going to give anybody any examples.
Um, I think inflation has a broader detrimental effect on people's lives and their perception of how things are going in the country than just those that are most affected by it and hurt the most by it. If you're someone who owns a home, you might want to move up. You might want to relocate. Your opportunities are being blocked. And for everybody, the worth of your savings, your value of your thrift is being eroded. And while peak inflation has gone down, it seems to be stuck at about a 2.5 to 3% rate. The Fed doesn't seem to have a particular plan to bring it down to its target of 2%. I happen to agree with Paul Volcker that the real target should be 0%. But a persistent 2.5 to 3% inflation rate erodes people's sense of financial security and is a proper concern. What is sad is that while it will drive a lot of the voting in this election, neither candidate has any particular standing as an inflation hawk or even someone who understands what creates inflation. We had both excessive monetary stimulus and excessive fiscal stimulus, and then we monetized the excessive fiscal stimulus. And we are unwinding that at a very slow rate. And the Fed has just announced that it's going to slow the rate of unwinding that even more. Biden plays the blame game that we discussed. He's saying that it's corporate greed that is driving up prices. Trump wants to take political advantage of what's happening, but he's someone who likes debt, favors easy money, and has a plan to undermine the independence of the Fed in a second term. So I think it's a serious problem, but it's one that neither side of our political divide is taking seriously or shows any sense of understanding it. You don't have Ronald Reagan being willing to stand beside Paul Volcker to break the back of inflation. And I don't think that there's an indication that the current Fed has more than a rhetorical commitment to doing that.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything that's been said, and I mean, what I'm going to say isn't popular on either side of the aisle, but this new protectionism and immigration restrictionism that we're seeing and is going to only grow, it's also going to cause more inflation. Now, that doesn't mean that I think there should be unfettered free trade like in some libertarian paradise, or that we should see completely open borders again, like in some libertarian utopian vision. But people also have to reckon with the consequences of these policy decisions to start to wall the United States off from the global economy. Trump wants to slap a 10% tariff on every single import. That's going to drive up consumer prices. And just the same as we were talking about restaurant service and other basic services that are so often provided by immigrants at relatively low wages, if we cut off immigration, then there are going to be consequences for people's pocketbooks as well. So, this new nationalism, this new kind of populism that we're seeing, these restrictions of trade in the name of the working class, maybe for preserving manufacturing jobs, etc., they all have a flip side of that coin as well, which means higher prices for consumers, and that's going to keep driving inflation. So I think that someone has to come clean with the American voters, and it's obviously not going to be the two candidates we have now. It's probably going to have to be the next generation of candidates, but someone's going to have to come clean and tell them the sort of trade-offs that are involved in this new nationalist approach to trade and immigration policy, and articulate some sort of a smart vision for decoupling from China, decoupling from relatively unfettered immigration flows without punishing American workers and American consumers through higher prices.
See, and that's interesting because I couldn't agree more. It's interesting, though, that essentially, given birth rates, we're going to need immigrants. We're going to need more immigrants, but it's a question of how they get here. There's a process. The bottom line is that we're going to need a lot of immigrants, a lot of immigration, but it's got to be tied to their skills, and that's not something that you hear about from Washington. And it's going to strike soon. It's already striking most of the world. I don't know what you guys think of Peter Zahan. He thinks that China and Russia are basically dead in 20 years, and that essentially there are only a few places in the world that will basically do well economically. We're one of them. One of them is where Henry's from, and strangely enough. And the other one, I have never looked at the demographics of France, but he says France will do well. But we'll do well because people want to live here. We'll be able to determine who comes in and what skills they need because they're still going to want to move here. And so it's a question of making the adjustment from something people are beginning to hate, which is basically immigration. And it's interesting because it's been a problem in Arizona for so long, you don't even think about it much, but you see the reaction in New York City and in Boston and some of these sanctuary cities when they actually get illegal immigrants. It's totally different story. But it is a situation that's going to be a problem until it's addressed by Congress, and that's not going to happen in the immediate future.
Yeah, one of my heroes right now in the world is, I hope I pronounce his name right, Javier Milei in Argentina. I spent a little bit of time in Argentina, and I saw how the inflation rate worked. I mean, literally, you could go pay for your hotel room by taking your dollars down and transferring them on the street, and the value picked up so much during that period of time, it would actually give you the money to make your rent almost nothing, or to prepay for your rent in a hotel room in itself by paying for it in the Argentina currency. He was elected spending almost no money on a very libertarian agenda, just saying, hey, we're going to balance the budget. We're going to strengthen our currency. And he has not only been able to get, elected, he's actually been successful in Argentina, beginning to curb it. So, Elliot, the question I'm going to ask you a very specific question on just the issue of finance, on money and spending. and inflation, which candidate do you think is better? And before I do that, I'm going to present what I've been reading from others, and then you can present your point of view, whether you would agree or disagree. What I'm hearing from people who are bond traders, from people like Larry Summers. Larry Summers was very critical of Joe Biden, said if you spend this additional money on dealing with COVID, you're going to create an inflationary effect. And he has been hawkish on trying to curb inflation. But now what he's pointing out is that the policies of Trump are much more inflationary than are Joe Biden's. Now, the first one is kind of the most interesting, which is just the pure politics of it, meaning if Joe Biden wins, he's probably going to have a divided Congress, and it's much more difficult for him to convince Republicans to spend more money than it is for Donald Trump if he has a divided Congress, because all a Republican president has to do to spend more is to say, well, here's what I want, and you Democrats want this, so I'll just put yours on top of it, and it creates additional spending. He also has a variety of things in his plan that are much more inflationary. The 10% tariff that he has produced on everyone throughout the world, sending back all immigrants, which could have a big effect on farm labor costs. Let's see, what was the third one? Oh, his the talk about trying to devalue the dollar to try to help our exports, and then also interfering with the Federal Reserve itself. Summers has pointed out, as have a number of others, folks from Cato and others, saying, hey, this is hugely problematic. Now, the good news to that might be maybe at some point if people recognize it's not going to work with Republicans, maybe we do get someone who's more of a libertarian like Javier. But at least on that issue, do you agree with Summers and others? Larry's been on this show. By the way, Peter also has been on this show and has talked about the demographics issue. But on the inflationary issue, when you compare the two, how do you see it?
Well, I think that inflation under Trump was very well controlled, that the real kick to inflation, as Milton Friedman put it, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And when Biden, I forget the name of the act, but the second he went into office, he threw $2 trillion at an economy that was already improving, where the employment was already coming back, where people already had a ton of money because they made more than their salaries in a lot of cases during COVID because of the government. And so it was what helicopter money, basically. Money just shows up, and we ran into, and we're still running into, too much money chasing too few goods. That doesn't necessarily explain where inflation is going to show up, but it's going to show up somewhere. And it did in housing, and now it is in food and other commodities. It's going to show up somewhere. Do I believe that Trump's going to do all these things? Not a chance in the world. I mean, it's political nonsense. But from my experience, and I believe that Biden's policies are much more likely to be inflationary than Trump's. I don't think either candidates are not inflationary. It's a question of degree, and who's ever elected might get lucky his first couple of years in office, if indeed rents keep on coming down as the number of units coming on the markets, especially apartment markets, really starts to take off. But neither one of them are non-inflationary, but I think that Biden's are clearly more inflationary because even most Democratic predecessors understood the risks of inflation and took steps to make sure it didn't get out of control. I don't think Biden has that type of mindset. Certainly not anything in the last 4 years gives me that feeling that he has that mindset.
I would have the following partial counterpoint to offer about the difference between the two candidates. Certainly, excessive fiscal stimulus accelerated grandly under Biden, but it began under Trump with his excessive COVID response. The main difference between the two candidates, or an important difference between the two candidates, is I think Biden has respected the independence of the Fed, even though inflation is killing him politically. He's not publicly jawbone for lower interest rates to try to give some kind of fuel to the economy before his election. Trump jawboned for lower interest rates throughout his tenure as president, threatened to fire if he had the authority. Powell for refusing to do so. And it was at a point where it was, I think, generally clear that interest rates needed to be moving in the other direction as a precaution and an unwinding of the excessive monetary stimulus that had existed going back to the aughts. And Trump has a plan in his second term, one of these things that are being concocted for trying to undermine the independence of the Fed, a required consultation with the president, one of the things that they have. Now, I don't think the Fed's done a good job ever since Volcker. I think Volcker was the last really solid Fed chairman that we had. But putting more political influence on the activities of the Fed is a recipe for it to be even worse. And so far, Biden has not done that, and I think he would continue to respect the independence of the Fed. And Trump clearly doesn't believes in easy money and doesn't believe in the independence of the Fed.
Yeah, I would. On that point, I'd absolutely agree with you. There was a book called The $1 Trillion Triage. It was written by who's the Wall Street Journal's lead economics reporter? I forget his name at the moment. It was a great book, but it did go into the detail that Bob is talking about, how Trump tried to undermine the independence of the Fed when the Fed was doing things he didn't agree with. So that's clearly going to be a risk.
Yeah, it's amazing how we're arguing about which one would be worse, though. There isn't a good choice.
Also, we're talking as if the economy is in some sort of an equilibrium, right? Where we can look at the response of the Fed remaining relatively stable to sort of equilibrium conditions, but there's also the possibility that the economy is not really in equilibrium and that we go into a recession. Elliot, we talked before about the huge amount of commercial real estate debt that's lurking out there that
Mhm.
has to be rolled over. You just mentioned that there's the same sort of an issue looming for apartment builders. And those are only maybe the most obvious factors that are lurking out that everyone knows about that could cause a recession. I know that the stock market has taken a huge boost recently because people are making really big bets on AI technologies delivering a lot of economic growth, but not everyone agrees that that's going to happen, and at least not going to happen as fast as some people think. So I think the reality is that when a recession does come over the next 4 years, whether we have Trump or whether we have Biden, we're going to see a big spending response. That's probably when the Fed is going to respond by lowering interest rates. And my assumption is that we probably would see another surge in asset prices that's only going to enrage lower income Americans even more as they are locked out of an even further escalating real estate market. Unless, of course, the even worse scenario happens, which is that real estate prices collapse as they did after the Great Recession. So I think that we have to also be aware of the fact that we talk about these things as if the economy is in some sort of equilibrium, but of course, there's always the possibility that something leaps up from somewhere we didn't expect and we hit some sort of an economic wall.
Yep. The old black swan. You never see it coming, and it's obvious after it occurs. Until the day it occurs, it is not obvious.
Right.
That's why it's called black swan. So
Paul and I had a really great conversation with an expert on energy last week, and it was so clear that a lot of these big bets on AI are predicated on huge increases on energy supply to these data centers that
no way.
just can't happen. And so, when you look at the stock price increases of the last 4 to 5 months, a lot of us are being driven by Nvidia, by Microsoft, by Google, big bets on AI, and it's
Yeah.
just not clear that they can deliver. So I think there's a lot of potential risk out there. I'm the son of a Scottish sheep farmer. So we're all about keeping our head above water. I see risk everywhere. And really do think that a lot of these questions could be resolved by events, dear boy, events, which is a quote, I think, from Hit the Elder or from Gladstone or someone like that.
You know, what to me was fascinating about Javier is that his ideas were not popular. It what was but the fact that he was telling the truth was popular. When he told people, no, we're going to have to lay off people inside of government, you can bet that was not popular. When you said, hey, you have to have less programs, we're going to have an effect on retirement. And he took on a whole series of issues running in Argentina that where none of the individual ideas were popular. But he said, if we can strengthen the economy, if we can strengthen the currency, if we can make certain that this is a great place to invest, if people begin to feel that there's stability here, we'll fix those other problems. Well, sure enough, they're now seeing a surge in reinvestments. Now, the United States is dramatically different than Argentina, but the ideas, I think, are still important, which is we have to get those basics under control, and controlling the federal debt, controlling the federal deficit are important aspects. We talked about immigration. One approach to immigration is open the doors and just let as many in as you want. Well, that's not the type of answer that's going to work, but you can create a immigration policy that says, hey, how do we go recruit and ensure that we're getting the right people into our country, as opposed to just closing it all down. Not tempering with the Federal Reserve, respecting the idea that that Federal Reserve gives us something that is of value. Those ideas, each one individually, may be unpopular, but I do think that we're getting to the point in time where we're going to need a candidate who's willing to espouse those types of ideals.
Well, let me. There's some real problems that with cutting the budget or making it grow more slowly. Defense spending as a percent of GDP in the U.S. is the lowest now since 1939, and we're facing any place between no wars and 3 wars on the horizon. And we're running out of bullets, and it takes much longer. There's a great book called The Arsenal of Freedom, where they talked about how the private sector and Roosevelt worked together to simply produce the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese out of existence. We could do things they couldn't. Right now, it takes so long and costs so much because there's so much technology in every weapon that's not going to happen. So we're really behind the 8 ball. So forget about defense spending cuts. It's probably going to go the other way. And now you're cutting into things that basically hurt people. And this isn't the silent generation. This isn't the greatest generation. This is Gen Z. And they're not going to take it the same way that my father or Bob's father took it. And it's going to be very dicey, I think. And I'm not sure how it plays out.
All right. So I'm going to make a little bit of a turn here. I'm going to put up some slides. So you had mentioned Peter Zion, and I am a big fan of Peter. He's he has the courage to actually make predictions almost every single day, which of course you're going to embarrass yourself when you do that sooner or later. But from a geopolitical standpoint, he's really fascinating to listen to. He's been on this show, and he likes to talk about demographics. But there was an article in The Economist this week that I found to be fascinating. And Elliot, I kind of want to pick your brain on this and hear from everyone else as well. What they did is they pointed out on this first slide that if you look at the different generations, the silent generation, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, and the millennials, you can see that there's a huge amount of net worth that have come from the boomers, that the boomers have been an incredibly large contributor. Now, one of the things that the article points out, and Elliot, maybe you can help me with this, but when people get to the retirement years, generally what they do is they begin the money that they've been saving, they begin to spend. And as they spend that money, they create an inflationary effect because you have more money going out, higher demand, but yet they're not workers. They're no longer in the workforce, so they create a higher demand. But what The Economist found, if you go to the next slide, is that what's actually happening with the boomers is not what was expected. In fact, around the world, they're actually saving, and their savings are growing faster than what they're spending. And so this was an MSCI stock market indices, which was based upon um, stocks that should go up if people who are retiring begin to spend more. And what they found is that actually wasn't correct. Those stocks have not done nearly as well as what they would have thought. And the last one is, if you go to this next slide, are the rising bank balances amongst people who are seniors. And you can see that the actual savings is going up. In fact, the economist said that they believed that the boomers are actually not only are their savings account rising, but they're leaving more money in, which is accumulating more wealth than they're actually spending on aggregate. In any event, I found that to be fascinating because it could be a little bit of a twist or a turn. Elliot, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think what you're going to see that's the twist and the turn is the amazing transfer of wealth that's likely to occur down to millennials, Gen X's and Gen Z's, and what they do with the money is going to be interesting. I think that a lot of baby boomers basically got to the point where they took the cruises, they went to Europe, they helped their kids buy a house, and now they're basically just sitting around enjoying themselves, playing golf now and then, going out to dinner, meeting with friends, so on and so forth. But they're not going, let's see how many Gucci handbags I can get for my wife. That's just not that way that generation was built. To me, the spending will come from younger generations that haven't saved and therefore haven't had the experience of being able to go out and spend as readily as boomers have. And that's something that we'll know about over the next several decades, but certainly Gen X's and Gen Z's and are in a different position than baby boomers.
Well, it'd be interesting to know how much of this net worth of the baby boomers is in IRAs and 401ks, in which case it would be a large taxable event if those that inherit that money withdraw it and spend it. Chances are they will be rolled over into decedent IRAs or some other protected retirement account. I don't know what the answer to that is. What percentage of that huge net worth for baby boomers is locked into accounts that have not yet been subject to taxation, and what effect that will have on the knock-on effect when it gets passed on. But it doesn't surprise me to see this. And I do think it is in part the baby boomers who inherited a reasonable amount of this from the silent generation, the greatest generation, wanting to provide for the retirement of the retirement security of their kids, believing that the ability of our children to have the same opportunities that we have may not be as assured as we formerly thought it would.
Yeah, the three big reasons the economists laid out that the boomers are doing this. The first one is bequeathing, the idea that they want to give something to their children. They're thinking about that. The second one is the view is that more Americans have become they begin to financially kind of understand the role that they play in spending and in savings. And by the way, not just in the United States, they found that in Japan and other nations where they're having similar challenges. But the last one was that that COVID actually created, in some cases, a more frugal group. Now, what was funny to me was, if it had been big spenders, we'd be blaming the boomers for inflation, but instead we're just calling them stingy. That was what the article was actually titled, but nonetheless.
It's also worth, I think, pointing out that the money which is saved and not spent is still economically productive. It creates seed capital um, uh,
Where?
for economic innovation and expansion. So these are not necessarily negative indicators. It just is a way in which we fuel the economy.
Yeah, this is an interesting statistic. I'm not really surprised. I've sort of seen similar reports over the years of the growing share of the older generations and net wealth. And what worries me is that you can sort of see a reflection of this, a mirror image of this in some of the surveys that you see among young people, millennials, and younger about the general trajectory of the country, of the world, whether they will do better than their parents and their grandparents, etc., before them. And what kind of worries me is that when young people see these sorts of dynamics and they know about them, then they really have the feeling that all the wealth is tied up among the older generations, that they are not going to have the same opportunities to build wealth as they did, which of course is not necessarily true, right? I think that there are scenarios we can imagine in which people are able to achieve exactly the same sorts of success that their grandparents did and their parents did. And it's kind of the job of our generation to ensure that comes about. So I hope that this isn't a recipe for generational populism. I worry that it is. We need some people putting forward a different kind of a message, right? To put forward the boomer generation's tremendous economic success as something to be emulated rather than something that's resented, right? That would be refreshing. Uh, in keeping with the tone of the rest of today's podcast, I'm not so sure whether I'm optimistic it's going to happen.
All right. So I'm going to turn back to Elliot with that point, and we'll make this the last point, which everybody can give a comment on. Elliot, you do a beautiful job of talking to young people about, you like to separate the economy into people instead of which generation, into quartiles, the people at the very top quartile, people at the bottom quartile. And you've given a very optimistic message before on this show about how people who are in the bottom quartile still have the opportunity to move up and the things that they need to do to be able to do that. If you would, talk about that for me.
There's only a few things you have to do to become really well off in America. First thing is you have to value an education. You have to basically be willing to put in the work to get educated, to get to college, or to get to it could even be getting to it's some type of you become a plumber or electrician, some skill that you need. You need to put in a lot of hours. People who are rich tend to put in tons and tons of hours. People who are on the bottom quintile put in considerably fewer hours. Now, it could be because of the situation they're in, but that's what the numbers say. You have to marry somebody who has the same point of view that you do in terms of the need to work hard, the need to put in the hours, and the need to be educated. You need to stay married, and you need to take care of yourself so you lower the probabilities that health issues take you out of the game. And that's basically all you have to do in America. Now, it's easy to say, it's tough to do, but that's what made the greatest generation the greatest generation. That's what made boomers. And I'm not sure what Gen Zs are going to take from this message, because at least from what you read in the papers, they're less fond of work than their parents and grandparents and their great grandparents were. But essentially, it's not a trick. Get educated, get married, stay married, work hard. That's basically it.
Amen. Never have the opportunities in America been greater and more broadly available. And that is the message we need to be developing and delivering to our young people, rather than this ideology that it's out of your control and the only way you gain is by taking from somebody else, and government and politicians ought to do that for you. It's a recipe for stagnation and decline. When, thanks to the civil rights era and the rise of women's rights. Opportunity in America has never been broader. And that's something we should celebrate, and the message we need to be delivering to young people.
Well, obviously, I agree with both Elliot and Bob, and I'm glad we're getting that message out here. I just got back from a trip to Mexico City. I was in Mexico City last week, had a great trip down there, visited one of the universities there, presented some research, but also had some time for sightseeing. And when you see a country that has such profound inequality and such crushing poverty like Mexico does, especially in some of the more less developed sections of Mexico City, it really makes you appreciate the opportunities and the infrastructure for getting ahead that there are and that there is in America. And so always going abroad puts a good perspective on coming back to the US, and it was no exception for me this time. And I agree with Elliot and Bob that you can get ahead in the United States if you follow these simple rules. And I was also relieved to hear Elliot's there was nothing about politics in those rules. Maybe it'd be better if we all forgot about politics for a while and just got down to leading what seems to me like a pretty happy, uncomplicated, fulfilling life.
No, I agree. It's not about politics. It's about how hard you as an individual, if you want to put forth the effort. And if you don't want to, you shouldn't expect the same returns.
Yeah, it's there's so much to take from this. And Henry, you first brought this up. Oftentimes as we're going through data or information, can feel a little bit distressing and overwhelming. But being optimistic does not mean that you avoid the problems. You have to take a look at the issues that are going on and the things that are taking place. But this is the United States of America, and the opportunity that is here it's still unprecedented. It's just unprecedented in terms of what you can do. One of the things, though, that I would point out, just that I heard from all three of you, and it seems to me that this is increasingly becoming a bigger challenge. It's the oldest story on the planet, the story of Cain and Abel, where one brother brooded over the benefits that the other brother had, the fact that his sacrifices seemed to be honored more. And he brooded to the point where he destroyed both of their lives. The reality is, envy is evil. It's just that simple. And our politics, it's way underserving America today. I mean, it's way underserving the greatness of America. But the greatness of America comes from that Constitution, where a very long time ago, we decided to empower the individual over government. We gave them civil rights, equal rights, human rights, property rights, the ability to have free markets. And those things mean that you have incredible opportunity here. Sometimes you just have to put your head down and go for it. Warren Buffett, many years ago, when I was about 30 years old, I had a chance to talk to him. I was just leaving the mayor's office. I guess I was 35 or something like that. And I asked him, I said, man, there are all these problems that are going on in this country. And what do you think I should do? Should I be investing now or raising money to go out and do something? He said, look, first, you live in the United States of America. Trust me, if you're going to make an investment, this is the place to do it. And then he said, and second, you're young and you live in the southwestern part of the United States. He said, it's going to be even better in that portion of the country, but have faith. And part of what you have to have faith in isn't just the American economy. It's yourself and your willingness that if you do those things that Elliot said, you can find success. I'd like to thank the entire panel today. Next week, we'll be going on and talking about some other business issues and some opportunities that are going on, but we very much appreciate you being here today.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks. Take care.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.